The first alarm tore through the station before I even opened my eyes. Not the soft chime that meant a supply ship was docking. The other one. The one that meant everyone needed to get behind a locked door within 30 seconds and stay there until someone told them otherwise. I was already moving before my brain caught up with my legs. Boots on, jacket half zipped, running down a corridor that was rapidly emptying in the opposite direction. Nobody was running to the windows to look. They were running away from them. "Ellison, get inside," someone called from a doorway. I didn't stop. Corvus Way Station sat on the edge of nothing, the last real outpost before Krivaxi space swallowed the stars whole. Nobody parked here for the view. They parked here because it was the final safe breath before the border, and the border had a reputation that bent every trade route 100 light-years out of its way, rather than risk crossing it. Not because of the Krivax men. Traders liked the Krivax men well enough. Calm, careful, always good for a fair deal. It was the females nobody wanted to meet. I reached the observation deck as the whole station shuddered under my feet. Through the reinforced glass, I watched something come down out of the dark, trailing fire, spinning far too fast to be anything but wounded. It hit the landing field hard enough that dust rose in a column even through the thin atmosphere shielding, and then it simply sat there, smoking, silent, like it had used the last of its strength just to land at all. Commander Voss's voice cut through every speaker on the station at once, flat and controlled in a way that only barely hid how frightened he actually was. "All personnel, seal your sections. Do not approach the landing field under any circumstances. I repeat, do not approach." Around me, people were already backing away from the glass, as if the wreck might reach through it and take them where they stood. I looked at that smoking hull for maybe 3 seconds longer than I should have. Then I turned and ran the other way, toward it. Derek Holt caught my arm at the junction, before the lower ramp, knuckles pale, around a weapon he clearly didn't want to use on me, but wasn't ruling out either. "Where exactly do you think you're going? Someone's alive out there." "Something dangerous is out there. You heard the commander." I heard him say don't approach. I didn't hear him say let them die on the tarmac. His jaw worked like he was chewing on an argument he already knew he would lose. "If that's what I think it is, Cade, it will not care that you brought a medkit. Then it can decide that after I've used it." I pulled free before he could make up his mind whether to actually stop me, and I ran. Nobody followed. That told me everything I needed to know about how this station felt about the things sitting out on the landing field. I had heard the stories the same as everyone else, growing up on relay feeds and border gossip passed hand to hand like something too dangerous to say out loud twice. Every species that had ever pushed too far into Krivaxi space eventually stopped pushing, and none of them liked to explain exactly why. The word that came up in every language, on every network, was always the same one: the reckoning. Centuries ago, an entire invasion fleet had gone in to take the Krivax homeworld, while, as far as anyone could tell, only the calm and reasonable Krivax men were supposed to be home. What came out to meet that fleet was not calm, and it was not reasonable, and by morning there was no fleet left to argue about it. No survivors, no wreckage worth salvaging, just silence, and a story every parent in known space eventually told their children to keep them well away from the border. You did not go looking for a war mother. You prayed, quietly and often, that you never met one at all. I reached the outer airlock alone, keyed the manual override because nobody at the control desk was ever going to open it for me, and stepped out onto the landing field carrying a medkit in one hand and absolutely nothing in the other. The wreck looked worse up close. Hull plating peeled back like foil, one strut bent at an angle it had never been built to hold. Half slumped against the open side of it was something the size of a doorway, dark-plated skin catching the field lights, one arm pressed hard against a wound along her side that was already slowing her breathing down to something shallow and wrong. She saw me before I saw her properly. That was the part that should have frightened me most. She was hurt, and she still saw me first. A weapon came up in her free hand, faster than anything that injured had any right to move, and settled dead center on my chest. I stopped walking, kept my hands where she could see them, medkit hanging loose from 2 fingers, nothing hidden, nothing sudden. "I'm not armed," I said, and felt foolish a second later for saying something she almost certainly could not understand yet. She did not fire. That was the first surprise. The second was that she did not lower the weapon either. She simply watched me, breathing hard, blood dark against darker plating, working through some calculation I had no way of reading. Behind me, over the comm still clipped to my collar, I could hear Commander Voss demanding to know who had opened the outer lock. I reached up and switched it off without looking away from her. "I'm going to kneel down," I said slowly, showing her the motion before I did it, dropping to one knee at a distance that still felt far too close and nowhere near close enough to actually help. "I have supplies, for the wound, that's all this is." The weapon did not move. Her eyes did, flicking to the kit, then back to my face, as though she were trying to decide which one of us was lying to the other. I stayed there a long moment, knee against permacrete, heart doing something well past its normal rhythm, and made myself breathe slowly enough that my voice would come out steady. "You're losing a lot of blood," I said. "I don't know your name, I don't know your language. But I know what that looks like, and I know how to slow it, if you let me." Nothing happened for a moment. Then, achingly slow, as though it cost her something to do it, the weapon lowered an inch. Then another. I took that as the only invitation I was going to get, and I moved. Up close, she was even larger than the doorway comparison had suggested, plated where a human has skin, built for a kind of strength that made the dent in the hull beside her look a little less impossible. The wound along her side was deep. Something sharp had gone through where armor should have covered her, and dark blood welled fresh with every breath. I worked fast, the way you learn to when a wound will not wait for you to be gentle about it. Pressure first, packing second, her breath hitching hard when I found the worst of the damage, her free hand closing around my wrist with enough force to grind bone if she had meant it as a warning. She did not mean it as a warning. I understood that a half-second later when I realized she was not stopping me. She was holding on. "Almost done," I said, not certain the words meant anything to her yet, saying them anyway because silence felt worse for both of us. "You're doing fine, just hold still a little longer." By the time I finished, my hands were shaking and her grip around my wrist had gone loose, not from losing consciousness, I realized with real relief, but because she had finally decided to let go of her own accord. A small device on her forearm crackled, flickered, and produced a voice built out of fragments, half her language and half something translated badly and far too late to be smooth. "Why," it said, in pieces, "did you not run?" I sat back on my heels, medkit empty beside me, and looked up at something every species in known space had spent generations teaching their children to fear. "Because you were dying," I said, "and everyone else was too scared to help you." The device took a moment to catch up, translating that back into her own language. Whatever it said to her, something in her expression changed, and for the first time since I had stepped onto that field, I understood I was not looking at a monster at all. I was looking at someone who had fully expected, right up until that moment, to die alone on a landing field, surrounded by an entire species too frightened to come near her. Behind me, the airlock cycled open again, boots hit the ramp, and Commander Voss's voice came through sharp, with a fear he had stopped bothering to hide. "Ellison, step away from it. Now." I did not move, neither did she, though her hand had drifted, slow and careful, back toward the weapon resting in the dust beside her. "She's not attacking anyone," I said, loud enough to carry without turning around. "She's wounded, and she needs a proper medical bay, not a firing line. You do not get to make that call. Somebody has to." I finally looked back over my shoulder. 6 of the station's response team stood at the base of the ramp, weapons raised, faces caught somewhere between duty and pure animal fear. Derek was among them, jaw tight, not quite meeting my eyes. Look at her. She hasn't fired once. Not when I walked out here alone, not now with 6 guns on her. If she wanted this station dead, we would already know it. Voss's eyes flicked from me to her and back, doing the same arithmetic I imagined every person on that field was doing. Fear built out of stories was easy to hold on to right up until the moment it had to survive contact with what was actually standing in front of you. She stays contained, he said finally, under guard. That's the only version of this where nobody gets hurt tonight. I looked down at her. She was watching the exchange with the flat, careful attention of someone who understood more of our language than her cracked little translator could keep up with, or who understood enough of tone and posture to read the shape of an argument even without the words. Contained, I repeated, low enough that only she might catch it, is better than dead, I promise you that much. Her hand stopped moving toward the weapon. Slowly, deliberately, she let it fall open in the dust, palm up, empty. It was not surrender. I understood that even then. It was a choice, made by someone with every reason not to make it, to trust one stranger with empty hands over an entire station full of people who would have been glad to watch her die rather than come near her. I stood, offered her my arm for support she did not strictly need, and helped her up anyway, because it seemed like the kind of thing you did for someone who had just decided, against every instinct a lifetime of fear had ever taught anyone, not to kill you. Behind us, the response team fell into a loose, wary escort formation, weapons still raised but no longer aimed to fire. Ahead of us, the airlock stood open, station lights spilling out onto the field like an invitation nobody had actually agreed to extend. I did not know yet what I had just done, walking a war mother through the front door of a station that had spent its whole existence terrified of exactly this moment. I only knew that whatever came next, I was not going to be the one who let her die out there simply because everyone else had been too afraid to try. She leaned harder against my shoulder as we crossed the threshold, and for just a moment, before the doors sealed behind us and the questions really started, it almost felt like the two of us were the only calm thing on the entire station. Voss walked ahead of us in silence, his shoulders set in the particular stiffness of a man rewriting an entire set of assumptions in real time and not enjoying a single second of it. Derek fell into step beside me, close enough to speak without the others hearing. "You do understand," he said quietly, "that if this goes wrong, it goes wrong for everyone on this station, not just you. I understand that if I'd done nothing, it would have gone wrong for her, and we would have called it caution instead of what it actually was." Derek didn't answer that. He didn't need to. I could see the old fear still sitting behind his eyes, the same fear every one of us had grown up with, and underneath it, something newer and far less comfortable starting to take root. The medbay doors opened ahead of us, bright and sterile, and utterly unprepared for what was about to be wheeled through them, and somewhere behind that fear, I understood, a much longer night was only just beginning. 2 hours after Commander Voss decided she would live under guard instead of a firing line, the deck beneath the makeshift medical bay let out a groan I felt through the soles of my boots before I heard it. I was standing just inside the doorway, arguing quietly with Elena Marsh about dosages our equipment had never been calibrated for, when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died. "That's not the wound," Elena said, already moving toward the failing support column at the far wall. "That's the section itself." The crash had done more damage than anyone had bothered to check, while everyone was busy deciding whether to be afraid of the survivor instead of the wreck. Whatever the impact had cracked in the framework beneath us had been sitting there quietly getting worse for 2 hours, and it chose that exact moment to stop being quiet about it. A support strut gave way, somewhere above the ceiling panels with a sound like something breaking its scale, and half the room tilted. I do not remember deciding to move. I remember Elena's foot catching on a fallen instrument tray, remember the ceiling section above her buckling loose from its mounts, remember understanding with total clarity that I was not going to reach her in time. Ishara reached her first. She came off the medical table she had no business standing up from, crossed the distance in a single motion that should not have been possible for someone with a wound that deep, and put herself under the falling section with both arms raised. Metal and insulation came down across her shoulders instead of onto Elena, and she held it there, teeth bared, breath ragged, long enough for both of us to scramble clear. "Move," she said, in words rough enough that I understood I was hearing her actual voice for the first time, not the translator's patchwork approximation of it. Whatever damage the fall had reopened along her side, she did not let it show in anything but the tightness around her eyes. I got an arm under Elena, hauled her back through the doorway, and turned to see Ishara, still holding the collapsed section, a moment longer than she needed to, making certain nothing else was coming down behind it before she let it drop and stepped clear herself. Emergency lighting kicked on a few seconds later, dim red instead of the section's normal white, throwing long shadows across a room that now had a very different problem to argue about. Derek Holt arrived with 2 members of the response team right as she straightened up, wound bleeding fresh through the packing I had put in less than 3 hours earlier. He had his weapon half raised out of habit before he actually looked at what had happened. At the ceiling section she was still standing beside, at Elena coughing dust behind me. He lowered it slowly. "She just saved your doctor," he said, like he needed to hear himself say it out loud to believe it. "She saved both of us," I said. I wasn't going to make it to Elena in time. Derek looked at Ishara a long moment, and something in his face shifted. Not trust exactly, but the particular kind of doubt that starts eating away at a story you have believed your entire life. "Get her somewhere stable," he said finally, "and get someone to look at that wound before it gets worse." It was not an apology, it was not even close to one, but it was the first order Derek Holt had given all night that was not built entirely out of fear, and I understood, watching him walk away to deal with the failing section instead of the survivor, that something on this station had just changed. We moved her to a smaller, more secure room near the old cargo bay, one with proper structural integrity and a door that actually sealed. Elena checked the wound again, quieter now, less clinical distance, and more the particular gentleness doctors use once they have decided a patient is a person rather than a threat. "You should not have done that," Elena told her, working carefully around the reopened edge of the injury. "Not with a wound like this." Ishara watched her work, translator crackling out a slow, imperfect version of whatever she said back. "Would you have preferred," it rendered, "watching?" Elena did not have an answer for that. Neither did I. Later that night, once Elena had finally gone to rest and the corridor outside had settled into something close to quiet, I brought a tray of food down myself, mostly because nobody else had thought to ask whether she could even eat what we ate. She studied the tray a long moment before touching any of it, turning a piece of dried fruit over in her fingers like it was evidence in a case she hadn't decided the verdict of yet. "Your food," the translator offered, "is very small. It's not built for someone your size. I can bring more." That was not a complaint. Something in her tone, even flattened through the translator, carried the faint shape of amusement. It was an observation. "Your entire species eats in portions built for children." I laughed before I could stop myself, and something about the sound seemed to catch her off guard, her head tilting slightly, studying me the way she had studied the food a moment earlier. "You laugh easily," she said, "for someone who nearly died walking toward a stranger with a weapon. You didn't shoot me. Statistically, that puts you well ahead of most of my dating history." The translator clearly had no idea what to do with that, and produced something halting and confused, but Ishara caught the tone if not the words, and the corner of her mouth did something that might, on a face built differently, have been the beginning of a smile. Over the following hours, something in the room settled into a kind of rhythm. The translator was old, salvaged, badly suited to her language's structure, but between its patchwork output and a growing catalog of gestures we built together out of necessity, we found ways to talk that did not depend entirely on the machine getting it right. I learned her name was Ishara Vantar, and that Vantar was not a family name in the way I understood family names, but something closer to a title earned rather than inherited. I learned she flinched, very slightly, every time someone mentioned the reckoning, and that the flinch was not fear of the word. It was something closer to grief, worn thin and careful, the way people hold old losses when they have had a very long time to practice not showing them. "You are not what the stories describe," I told her once, late enough into the night cycle that the station had gone mostly quiet around us. The translator hesitated over that one, clearly struggling with syntax, before settling on something close enough. "Stories," it rendered, "are easier than people. People require someone to actually look." I thought about that longer than I probably should have. I asked her, carefully, what she had been doing out past the border alone, injured, with a ship that looked less like a diplomatic vessel and more like something built for speed over comfort. She went quiet for a while before answering, and when the translator finally caught up, it delivered something shorter and more careful than anything she had said yet. "Running," it said, "from something that wants what I carry more than it wants me dead, though it will settle for both, if it must." "What do you carry?" She looked at me a long moment, weighing something I could not read on a face built so differently from my own, and then simply shook her head, a gesture close enough to human that I understood it without any translation at all. "Not yet." I did not push. I had learned enough about patience in the last several hours to understand it was the only currency that mattered here. Derek found me in the corridor outside her door sometime past the middle of the night cycle, 2 cups of the station's terrible coffee in his hands, one of which he held out to me without a word. "You're not sleeping either," I said. "Hard to sleep when half of what you grew up believing just picked a ceiling beam off your doctor instead of letting it happen." He leaned against the wall beside me, staring at nothing in particular. "I've spent my whole career training for the day one of them showed up. Never once trained for what to do if she turned out to be the one worth protecting instead of the one to protect against. Nobody trains for that. That's sort of the problem." He was quiet a while, turning the cup in his hands. "For what it's worth, Cade, whatever you did out on that field, I don't think I would have done it. I want you to know that costs me something to admit. You did the next best thing. You didn't stop me. I almost did. But you didn't." He almost smiled at that, tired and unconvinced but real. "Don't get used to it. I'm still watching her." "Good. Watch her save someone else's life while you're at it." On the second night, I asked her something I had wondered since the landing field, though I had not found the right moment to ask it until then. "Why War Mother, of all the titles you could have been given?" She considered the question long enough that I thought the translator had simply failed to carry it across. When she finally answered, her voice had gone quieter, less guarded than I had heard it yet. "Because the ones who carry that title are the ones who decide what a mother is willing to do for what she has not yet lost," the translator rendered, slow and careful, like the machine itself understood this one mattered. "Kryvak's men build the peace. They are patient and careful, and very good at making certain peace lasts as long as it can. But when patience fails, someone must be willing to do what patience no longer allows. That duty falls to us. It always has." That sounds like a heavy thing to be born into. It is not born. It is chosen, and then carried, whether or not the day ever comes when it is needed. She looked at me, something old and tired behind her eyes. "Most of us live our entire lives and are never called to prove it. I did not expect to be one of the ones who was. What happened to the others? The ones who were called?" The question landed somewhere I had not meant to aim it, and for a long moment she did not answer at all, her gaze drifting toward the small viewport as though the stars beyond it held something worth studying more closely than my face. "Some of them," she said finally, "are the reason I am carrying what I am carrying. Their names deserve better than to be spent as evidence, but evidence is what the truth requires, and I have made my peace with what that costs." I did not ask again that night. Some doors, I was learning, opened only as far as the person on the other side of them was ready to let them. Word travels fast along the border, faster than any of us like to admit, and Corvus Way Station was not built to keep secrets. A departing cargo hauler had filed its routine transit report less than a day after the crash, and routine transit reports get logged, cross-referenced, and occasionally read by people whose entire job is watching for exactly this kind of anomaly near Krivaxi space. I did not know that yet, sitting in that small secured room with a woman half the galaxy considered a myth built to frighten children. I only knew that something in her had begun, slowly and with visible effort, to unclench, and that the quiet stretch we had all been enjoying was borrowed time neither of us had actually earned yet. It was Elena who noticed the sensor alert first, 3 days later, stepping into the doorway with an expression that told me the calm we had all settled into was about to end. "Unidentified ship on long-range approach," she said. "Not one of ours. Not one of the Krivax patrol routes either. Command wants everyone at their stations." I looked at Ishara. Something in her posture had already changed before Elena finished the sentence, some instinct older and faster than translated words, and when the display in the corner of the room flickered to life with the ship's transponder signature, I watched the last of the calm I had spent 3 days helping her find drain completely out of her face. "That is not a patrol ship," the translator rendered, flat and careful in the way people get when they are working very hard not to sound afraid. "That is them." "Them," I repeated, "the ones you were running from." She did not answer with words. She reached instead for the small device strapped along her forearm, the same one that had been crackling out broken translations for 3 days, and pressed something into it I had not seen her use before. A different light came on, steady and red, and I understood without needing the translator to explain it, that whatever she had just done, it was not going to make the next several hours any easier for either of us. What was that? "Insurance," she said, the word arriving clean and unbroken for the first time since I had met her, like she had saved her best working vocabulary for exactly this moment. "In case insurance is all that is left. You're not going to tell me what you're carrying, are you?" "Not until I have to." She looked at me, and for the first time since the landing field, I saw something close to fear in her expression, though it was not fear for herself. And I would very much prefer it does not come to that today. Outside, the alert klaxon began again, different in tone from the one that had first pulled me out of bed 3 days earlier, and I understood, standing in that small secured room with a woman who had just decided to trust me with something far larger than a translated sentence, that whatever had found her out here had not come to negotiate. The hail came through every channel at once, demanding a response before Commander Voss had even reached the bridge. "Corvus Way Station. This is Overseer Voth of the Concord Vessel Adjudicator. You are harboring a fugitive responsible for the destruction of Concord assets and the deaths of Concord personnel. Surrender her and any property in her possession within the hour, and this matter ends without further incident." I stood at the edge of the command deck, close enough to hear everything, too far down the chain to be part of the decision. Voss stared at the display a long moment before keying his own channel open. "Overseer. This station has taken in an injured party following a crash. We have made no determination regarding fugitive status, and we are not in the business of handing over survivors on the word of a single hailing frequency." "Then allow me to shorten your determination process considerably." Voth's voice carried the particular flatness of someone entirely unused to being told no. "The individual in question is a war mother. I trust that word alone answers most of your remaining questions." Around the command deck, I watched the old fear ripple through every face that heard it. The same fear that had cleared this station's corridors 3 nights earlier. The same fear that had almost let a wounded woman die alone on a landing field. Voth was not threatening the station. He did not need to. He was simply reminding everyone what they already believed, and letting that belief do the threatening for him. "I need to speak with her," I said, already moving before Voss had finished deciding whether to let me. He caught my arm on the way past. "Cade. You heard him. He's not asking. He's informing us of a decision he's already made. I would like to at least understand what we're actually deciding before we make it for her." Voss held my eyes a moment longer, then let go. "You have until I need an answer for him, which is not long." I found Ishara standing at the small viewport in her room, watching the same display feed the rest of the station was watching, the Concorde vessel sitting outside the station like a held breath. "Fugitive," I said. "Destruction of Concorde assets. Deaths of Concorde personnel. Is any part of that true?" She turned from the window, and for the first time since the landing field, I watched something in her expression settle into a kind of tired resolve, the look of someone who has been rehearsing an explanation for longer than she has had anyone willing to hear it. "Some part of every lie is usually true," the translator rendered, steadier now than it had been 3 days ago, either repaired or simply better calibrated to the shape of her voice. "I did destroy something of theirs, a listening relay, positioned to track exactly this kind of transit through the border. I destroyed it because it had already found me, and because what I carry does not survive discovery twice. And the deaths. 2 of their crew, aboard the same relay station, in the same engagement." Something in her voice did not soften around this part, though I understood by then that it cost her something not to let it. "I did not go looking for that outcome. I did not walk away from it easily either, but I will not pretend it did not happen simply because the reason behind it makes the truth more complicated than Voth would prefer you to hear." "Then help me understand the complicated part." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, it was slower, more careful, like she was choosing each translated word for weight rather than speed. "You have heard of the reckoning. Everyone has heard of the reckoning. Then you have heard the version built to be repeated. An invasion fleet came for our homeworld, and something answered that no one who saw it lived to properly describe, and the fleet ceased to exist. That much is true. What is missing is who sent that fleet, and why they believed, with such confidence, that Cryos would be undefended when they arrived. Why did they believe that? Because we were meant to be elsewhere. A colony 3 transits from home was under threat, urgent enough that every war mother capable of answering the call had already left to defend it. It was not a coincidence. It was a diversion, engineered with enough patience and precision that our ancestors did not recognize it as one until the invasion fleet was already inside our system, believing the homeworld sat open and unguarded. But it wasn't. A small number remained. Enough, as it happened, though not because anyone expected it to be. She looked at me a long moment. The fleet that came for Cryos that night did not belong to some anonymous ancient empire lost to history, Cade. It belonged to the body that would go on, in the centuries afterward, to call itself the Concorde. I felt something cold settle in my chest, the particular stillness of a piece finally sliding into a place it had clearly been shaped for all along. They tried to invade your homeworld and failed so completely that the story became about the ones who defended it instead of the ones who attacked. An empire cannot admit it launched an unprovoked invasion against a sovereign world and lost every ship it sent. Not without consequences, no ruling body survives. But an empire can absolutely admit, with great sorrow and caution, that it once encountered savage, unprovoked monsters at the border, and that every soul in known space owes it a debt of gratitude for the vigilance that has kept those monsters contained ever since. Her voice, even through the translator's imperfect rendering, carried something close to exhaustion. Fear is useful, Cade. It justifies fleets. It justifies blockades. It justifies control over every trade route that touches our border, for the safety of everyone, of course. Centuries of profit and power, built on a story that was never true, and maintained by making certain no one ever heard it told any other way. What do you carry that's worth all of this? Proof. The word landed clean, unbroken, deliberate. Original fleet logs from that night, recovered decades ago from records the Concorde believed long destroyed, along with testimony verified by 3 independent Krivax historical bodies. Enough to end the story they have spent centuries selling, if it ever reaches somewhere neutral enough to be believed. And that's where you were going. Not raiding, not invading anyone. You were trying to deliver history. I was trying to end a lie, old enough that most of the galaxy has forgotten it was ever a choice to believe it. I sat with that a long moment, the command deck's earlier fear replaying itself in my head, with an entirely different shape now. Voss and Holt and every frightened face on this station reacting not to a monster, but to the echo of a story built specifically to make certain nobody ever looked closely enough to ask who benefited from being afraid. "I need to show Voss something," I said. "Do you have any part of what you're carrying in a form I could actually present? Not everything. Enough." She considered that a long moment, then reached for the device on her forearm, drew something small and dark from a hidden seam along it, and placed it in my open hand. "A fragment," she said, "enough to verify the rest exists, if anyone with the right equipment cares to check. Not enough, on its own, to finish this." I closed my fingers around it, and she caught my wrist before I could pull away, her grip lighter than it had been on the landing field, but no less certain. "If Voth boards this station," she said, "he will not stop until he has this, and me, and every witness who heard me say any of it. If it comes to that, you let him have me. Cade, the proof, reaching somewhere safe, matters more than whether I am the one who delivers it. No, you did not ask what I wanted. I don't need to. I've spent 3 days watching you save people who spent their whole lives being told to fear you. I'm not spending the 4th handing you over because the math looks cleaner that way." Something crossed her face that the translator had no word for at all, and for a moment, neither of us said anything further. I went looking for corroboration before I went looking for Voss, because I understood by then that a station full of frightened people was not going to take a stranger's translated word over a Concorde overseer's flat certainty, not without something harder than a story to set against it. Corvus kept its own transit archive, decades of shipping manifests and old diplomatic bulletins nobody had bothered to purge, mostly because nobody had ever needed to look at them closely before. I pulled every file that so much as mentioned the reckoning, cross-referencing dates against fleet movements, discarding a dozen dead ends before I found the thread actually worth pulling. It was an old bulletin from a Concorde historical office, dated more than a century back, quietly noting a discrepancy in fleet deployment records from the era of the reckoning that had never been publicly resolved, ship registries that did not match the official account. A gap in the timeline exactly where the diversion to that distant colony was supposed to have taken place. It was a single paragraph, buried in an appendix nobody had read in decades, and it did not prove everything Ishara had told me. It proved enough. Enough that the official story had at least one thread already fraying before I had ever touched it. I brought both the fragment and the bulletin to Voss myself, laid them out without embellishment, and let him reach his own conclusion instead of demanding he reach mine. Elena and Derek were already there when I arrived, called in, I gathered, because Voss had decided this was not a decision he wanted to make without every voice on this station that had actually met her. He was quiet for a long time after reading it. "If this is real," he said finally, "we are not looking at a fugitive hunt. We are looking at a Concorde overseer trying to silence a witness before that witness can finish testifying. That's what I believe, yes. Believing it and proving it to an armed warship currently sitting outside our hull are 2 very different problems, Cade. I know." Derek leaned against the far wall, arms folded, studying the bulletin like he was hoping it might change its answer if he looked at it long enough. "For what it's worth, Commander, she held a sealing off my doctor 3 days ago at a cost to herself she didn't have to pay. I've spent longer around genuine threats than I care to admit, and threats don't generally do that. That's sentiment, Derek, not evidence." "It's both," Elena said quietly. I'd like that on record too. Voss looked at each of us in turn, and I watched something settle behind his eyes, the particular weight of a man who understood that whatever he decided in the next several minutes was going to define this station for a long time afterward, regardless of which way it went. Before he could answer, the comm crackled with Voth's voice again, thinner with impatience now, the earlier flat calm beginning to show cracks of its own. Corvus Way Station, your window is closing. I am not interested in whatever delay tactic your linguist is currently attempting on your behalf. Surrender the fugitive and the property she carries within the next 30 minutes, or I will consider this station complicit in the destruction of Concord assets, and I will act accordingly. Voss closed the channel and looked at the three of us, and for the first time since I had known him, I watched genuine uncertainty settle across a face built for command. 30 minutes, he said, to decide whether we believe a story nobody in this station had heard until tonight, over a warning every one of us has been raised on since birth. You don't have to believe the whole story in 30 minutes, I said. You just have to decide whether you're willing to hand someone over to be silenced, on the word of the person doing the silencing. Voss looked past me, through the reinforced glass, toward the Concord vessel waiting outside, like a verdict already decided. And if he's telling the truth instead of her, then we hand over a fugitive and we lose nothing we didn't already expect to lose the moment that ship arrived. I held his gaze. But if she's telling the truth, and we hand her over anyway, we don't just lose her. We become the station that helped bury it. Voss looked at Derek. Derek looked back and gave the smallest possible nod, the kind that costs a man more than a long speech ever could. He looked at Elena, who did not hesitate at all. We already made this decision 3 days ago, Elena said, the moment we decided her wound was worth treating. Everything since has just been catching up to it. Voss exhaled slowly, the sound of a commander setting down a weight he had been carrying since the first alarm went off. Get everyone to defensive stations, he said, and somebody find out what we've actually got to fight with, because I don't intend to spend the next 30 minutes deciding whether we believe her, only to hand her over anyway when the shooting starts. The countdown Voth had given us kept moving whether any of us had decided anything yet, and somewhere below decks, I understood, Ishara was almost certainly preparing herself for the version of this where nobody chose to believe her at all. I went to tell her otherwise myself, because some things deserve to be said in person rather than relayed through a corridor full of people bracing for a fight none of them had ever expected to have on this side of the border. She was standing exactly where I had left her, weapon already in hand, watching the door with the look of someone who had already made peace with several possible outcomes and was simply waiting to learn which one had been chosen for her. They believed you, I said. Something in her posture eased, just slightly, before the caution returned. Belief and a fleet outside your hull are different problems. Voss knows that. He's putting the station on defensive footing anyway. Why would he do that? He has no obligation to your species' history or mine. He could hand me through the airlock in the next 20 minutes and lose nothing but a guest he never asked to host. Maybe, but then he'd have to live with knowing exactly what he handed over, and why, for the rest of his life. Some costs don't show up on a ledger, but people still have to pay them. She studied me a long moment, and I understood she was turning that thought over in a language built for entirely different ideas about duty and sacrifice, trying to find the shape of it that made sense in her own words rather than mine. On Krios, she said finally, we have no equivalent phrase for what your commander is choosing to do. The closest I can offer your translator is something like standing where standing costs you something and gains you nothing visible. We do not consider it remarkable. We consider it the minimum a person owes another person. I did not expect to find it here, of all places, among a species that spent 3 days deciding whether I deserved to survive my own crash landing. Maybe that's the part of us worth knowing about. We're slow to trust. But once we do, we don't do it by halves. I am beginning to understand that. She looked toward the door, toward the corridor beyond it, where I could already hear the low, purposeful noise of a station converting itself from a trading post into something built to hold a line. 20 minutes, Cade. Whatever comes after that, I want you to know that whatever happens to me, you already gave me something Voth's entire fleet cannot take back. You gave me a witness who chose to believe the truth before it was proven convenient to. You're not dying today. I didn't drag you through that airlock just to lose the argument 20 minutes later. The ghost of that almost smile crossed her face again, faint but real. Then I suggest we both go make certain of it. The 30 minutes ran out, with nobody on the command deck saying a word. Voth did not wait for confirmation of our silence to mean anything. The Concorde vessel's weapons array lit up on our sensors less than a minute after the deadline passed, and the first strike hit our outer shield generator hard enough to knock every non-essential system on the station offline at once. "They're not trying to breach the hull," Voss said, watching the readouts with the particular calm of someone who had stopped being surprised the moment the countdown began. "They're trying to force a surrender before they have to actually fight for her." "Then we don't surrender," Derek said, already moving toward the security station, weapon in hand, for reasons that no longer had anything to do with fear of the woman 2 decks below us. I ran for the same secured room I had left 20 minutes earlier and found Ishara already on her feet, weapon in hand, watching the door like she had known exactly how long 30 minutes would actually last. "They are not here for negotiation," she said, translator steady now, almost unnecessary between us at this point. "I know." "Then you know what comes next is not something I can promise to survive cleanly." She looked at me a long moment. "If it comes to a choice between the fragment surviving, and I do not, you let me go, Cade. The proof matters more than either of us." "I'm not doing that." "You may not have a choice." "Then we'll make sure it doesn't come to that." The station spent its last few minutes of quiet, doing the kind of work that never shows up in the stories people tell afterward. Derek redirected what little defensive charge the old station batteries could hold toward the sections most likely to be breached first. Voss pulled every able body from the cargo levels and stationed them where a corridor's width actually meant something tactically instead of just architecturally. Elena laid out every medkit the station owned along a single wall, triage lines already sketched out in her head before a single shot had been fired. I checked the seal on the door to Ishara's room twice, then a third time, though I understood even as I did it that a locked door had never once been the thing keeping either of us safe. It had always been a choice, made and remade, one conversation at a time. "You're frightened," Ishara said, watching me from across the room. "Yes. That is not a criticism. I know. I just wanted to say it out loud once before the deciding starts, so it doesn't get to hide anywhere later and pretend it wasn't there." Something in her expression softened at that, brief and real. On Cryos, we say fear is only dangerous when it is left unspoken. Spoken, it becomes information. You have just made yourself harder to surprise. Is that a compliment? It is the closest thing my language has to one, in a moment like this. The first boarding pod hit the outer hull 4 minutes later, cutting through a maintenance section nobody had reinforced, because nobody had ever expected to need it reinforced. I heard the breach alarm through the walls before the comm even finished relaying it, and I understood, running toward the sound with Derek and 2 members of the response team, that whatever came next was not going to look anything like the calm, careful standoff on the landing field 3 nights earlier. We met the first wave of Concorde troopers in the narrow service corridor outside the cargo bay, and it was Derek who found the trick that mattered most, venting the unpressurized storage section ahead of them just long enough to buy us time to fall back and regroup, using the station's own bones against an enemy that did not know it as well as we did. A younger member of the response team, a woman named Priya, who had barely said a word to me in the 3 days since the crash, held the junction behind us with a length of pipe and a fire suppression canister when her weapon jammed, buying Elena the seconds she needed to get a wounded crewman clear of the corridor. 3 nights earlier, she had been one of the loudest voices demanding Ishara be thrown back out the airlock. Tonight she was holding a line for the same reason the rest of us were, because somewhere in the last 3 days, fear had stopped being the only thing any of us were capable of feeling. Ishara met the second wave herself, and for a handful of desperate minutes I understood, watching her move through that corridor, exactly why an entire galaxy had built centuries of fear around what a war mother could do in a fight. It was not cruelty. It was precision, economy, a kind of controlled violence that ended things quickly and left nothing to argue about afterward. A trooper broke from the second wave and came straight at me while I was hauling a fallen crewman clear of the crossfire, close enough that I saw the weapon swing up before I had any real plan for what to do about it. I got a supply crate between us, more from instinct than strategy, felt the shot graze the edge of it close enough that the heat of it reached my arm, and understood, in the space of that single heartbeat, exactly how far outside my own competence this fight actually was. Derek put the trooper down from the far end of the corridor before I had to find out what came next, and didn't so much as pause to see if I was steady before turning back to the line. "Stay behind something solid," he shouted, already moving. "That's an order, not a suggestion." I stayed behind something solid. It did not make the next several minutes feel any less like standing at the edge of something enormous and completely indifferent to whether I understood it. It was also, I could see clearly, even in the chaos, costing Ishara everything her injury had left her to give. She staggered once, favoring the side that had been torn open on the landing field and torn open again, saving Elena 3 days later, and for just a moment, her guard dropped low enough that the trooper behind her raised a weapon not at her, but past her, toward where I stood, trying to help Elena drag a wounded crewman clear of the corridor. I did not see Ishara decide to move. I only understood, a half-second later, that she had put herself between that weapon and me the same way she had put herself under a falling ceiling 3 days earlier, and that this time the cost landed exactly where it was aimed. She went down hard, and for one long, terrible moment, the entire corridor seemed to stop. Ishara. I do not remember deciding to say her name instead of shouting for Elena. I remember only that it was the first word out of my mouth, and that it did not feel like the moment for anything else. She was still breathing when I reached her, teeth gritted against pain. She was not bothering to hide anymore, one hand pressing hard against a wound that had nothing left to spare. "The fragment," she said, voice rough, barely holding translation together at all now. "Still safe. I don't care about the fragment right now." "You should." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her face. "It is why any of this started." I got an arm under her, the same way I had gotten an arm under Elena 3 days earlier, and hauled her back from the corridor's edge, while Derek and the response team held the line behind us. Around me, I realized, something had shifted in the fight itself. Crew members who had spent 3 nights flinching at the mention of her name were now standing shoulder to shoulder with security personnel, holding a line for a woman most of them had refused to even look at less than a week ago. It was Elena, arriving breathless with a med kit of her own, who found the comm panel still active in the wall beside us and made the decision that changed everything that came after. "Every channel," she said, keying it open before anyone could stop her. "Let the whole sector hear exactly what this is." Her voice went out unfiltered, describing the attack in real time, describing a Concord overseer assaulting a civilian way station to silence a wounded survivor and bury evidence of a centuries-old lie, describing it to anyone listening on any frequency within 100 light-years, because if Corvus Way Station was going to fall tonight, it was not going to fall quietly. I pressed both hands hard against the wound while Elena worked, watching Ishara's eyes lose and regain focus in a rhythm that terrified me more than the fighting still going on somewhere down the corridor. "Stay with me," I said, the same 3 words I imagined every frightened person on every side of every corridor in known space had said to someone at some point, Except this time, I meant them for a woman the galaxy had spent centuries teaching everyone never to get close enough to say them to at all. Her hand found my wrist again, weaker than it had been on the landing field. But there. Still here, the translator managed, fragmented and faint. Still here. I do not know how many ships actually heard Elena's broadcast. I know it mattered, because less than 10 minutes later, the corridor lighting flickered from the deep red of battle alert to something else entirely, and the comm channel Voth had used to deliver his ultimatum crackled back to life with a very different voice on the other end of it. Kryvax patrol vessels, 3 of them, dropping out of transit close enough to Corvus Way Station that their arrival rattled the hull almost as hard as the Concorde's opening strike had. I learned only later that Ishara's forearm device had done more than translate. The signal she had sent the moment our own sensors first flagged the Concorde ship had been a distress call on a frequency reserved for exactly this kind of last resort, one that took every hour since to actually reach anyone close enough to answer it. Voth's ship broke off the assault within minutes of the patrol vessel's arrival, weapons powering down, hailing frequencies gone entirely silent rather than attempt to explain, to an armed Kryvax patrol, why a Concorde vessel was in the middle of assaulting a civilian station over one wounded war mother. I did not watch it retreat. I was too busy keeping pressure on a wound that refused to stop bleeding, saying her name over and over in a voice that had stopped sounding steady several minutes earlier, and understanding, with a clarity that had nothing to do with fear this time, exactly how much I did not want this particular fight to be the last thing either of us survived. Around us, the corridor slowly stopped sounding like a battlefield and started sounding like a station full of people realizing, all at once, that they had survived something they never should have had to face at all. Priya sat against the far wall, pipe still in one hand, staring at nothing. Derek called out a head count in a voice that cracked once before he steadied it. Voss's voice came through the comm a moment later, hoarse with relief he wasn't bothering to disguise, confirming what the sudden quiet had already told us. Nobody cheered. I remember that clearly, because some part of me had expected they would, the way it seemed to happen in every recording of every battle I had ever watched growing up. Instead, people simply sat down where they were standing, or checked the person nearest them for injuries, or stared at the scorched corridor walls like they were only now allowing themselves to understand how close the last hour had actually come to ending very differently. Elena worked over Ishara with a speed that left no room for anything but the wound in front of her, cutting away ruined packing, calling out instructions to a crewman I did not recognize who had appeared with a second medkit from somewhere down the line. I stayed exactly where Ishara's hand still gripped my wrist, because letting go felt like admitting a possibility neither of us was ready to name out loud. "The station holds," Elena said, more to herself than to either of us, checking a reading on a portable scanner with hands that were not quite steady yet. "Vitals are weak, but they're holding. She needs a real medical bay, not a corridor floor, but she's holding." "Then let's get her one," I said. And between the 3 of us, we did, moving slowly enough not to worsen the wound, and quickly enough that I did not have to spend another minute wondering whether slow had been the wrong choice. Behind us, the sound of Concorde engines fading into transit gave way to something else entirely, the deep, resonant hum of Kryvax vessels closing the last distance to dock, carrying with them questions I understood, even through the haze of adrenaline and fear, that none of us were fully ready to answer yet. 3 Kryvax warships held position outside Corvus Way Station for 11 hours before anyone came aboard, and every one of those hours felt longer than the battle that had brought them here. Ishara spent most of it unconscious in a real medical bay this time, one with equipment actually built for injuries like hers, brought over by the patrol vessels within the first hour of their arrival. Elena stayed with her through most of it, refusing relief twice, and I stayed because leaving did not feel like something I knew how to do anymore, not after everything the last several days had cost both of us to survive. "She's stable," Elena told me somewhere around hour 9, exhaustion flattening her voice into something almost gentle. Whatever hit her clipped enough that another few centimeters would have ended very differently, but she's stable. I do not remember exactly what I said back. I remember mostly just breathing, properly, for what felt like the first time since the corridor. Voss found me there sometime after hour 10, 2 cups of the same terrible coffee Derek had once brought me, and sat down across from me without asking whether I wanted the company. For what it's worth, he said, I've been running this station 11 years. I have never once been prouder of a decision I made under pressure than the one to stand behind you today. I want that on record too, since apparently that's become something people do around here now. You almost didn't make it. I almost didn't. That's usually how the decisions that matter work. If they were easy, they wouldn't need someone willing to make them. He turned the cup in his hands, echoing the same tired gesture Derek had made 3 nights earlier. Priya asked me today whether we're going to keep running the old evacuation drills. The ones built entirely around the assumption that a war mother showing up means everyone locks a door and prays. What did you tell her? That we're going to write new ones. Assuming, of course, that Ambassador Wren's people don't have some very pointed questions for us first. The Kryvax delegation that finally came aboard was smaller than I expected. 3 figures, led by someone introduced simply as Ambassador Wren, a Kryvax man with the same calm, measured bearing every trader who had ever dealt with his people always described. Though I understood now, in a way I had not fully understood before any of this began, exactly how much that calm cost an entire species when their reputation with the rest of the galaxy hinged so completely on the other half of them never being seen at all. Wren's questions were careful, precise, entirely without the flat certainty Voth had carried onto every channel he had ever opened toward this station. He listened to Voss's account, to Derek's, to Elena's, and finally to mine, and he did not interrupt any of us once, though I understood from the particular stillness in his posture that some of what he heard cost him something to sit with. You have no obligation to have done any of this, he said to me eventually, once the accounts were finished, and the room had gone quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet after everyone has said everything they actually know. You are aware of that. I'm aware. Every account we have gathered from your crew describes the same beginning. Alarms, an order to remain behind sealed doors, every reasonable incentive to do exactly what every other species in known space has done at the mention of a war mother for longer than your own species has had ships capable of reaching this border. He studied me a long moment. And you walked out onto the landing field anyway. Someone was dying. Nobody else was moving. I didn't see another option worth calling reasonable. Something shifted in Wren's expression, subtle enough that I might have missed it a week earlier, before I had spent days learning to read expressions built along entirely different lines than my own. There is a word in our language, he said, that does not translate cleanly into yours. The closest rendering your device will offer is something close to guardian, though that flattens most of what it actually carries. It is given, rarely, to those who choose to stand beside us when every incentive available to them points toward standing anywhere else. I wasn't trying to earn anything. That, Wren said, is precisely why it is offered. The fragment I had carried to Voss during the ultimatum, along with the full data core Ishara had protected through everything that followed, went to Wren's people for verification within the first day of their arrival, and the results came back faster than I expected, given how many centuries the story it contradicted had been allowed to calcify into something everyone simply accepted as true. The logs were authentic, the testimony held up against records the Kryvax had preserved carefully, quietly, for exactly the moment someone might finally be willing to listen. The reckoning had not been a monstrous, unprovoked assault by savage aggressors defending nothing but their own violent nature. It had been a homeworld's desperate answer to an invasion engineered by an empire that went on, in the centuries since, to build its entire border policy on the fear that answer had left behind. There will be a formal accounting, Ren told Voss and me both, on the second day of the verification process, standing at the same viewport where I had first told Ishara she was not what the stories described. Not an immediate one. Empires this old do not unravel over a single confirmed data core, whatever the truth of it turns out to be. But the Concord has just discovered, in the least controlled way possible, that the silence it has relied on for centuries is no longer guaranteed. That is not nothing. In time, it may prove to be everything. I do not know exactly how the broadcast Elena sent during the attack spread as far as it did, or how quickly, but within days, fragments of it were circulating on relay networks well beyond this sector. Alongside pieces of the Kryvax verification report Ren's people released through proper diplomatic channels rather than leave the story to rumor alone. A trade consortium 2 sectors over that had rerouted its entire supply chain around Kryvaxi space for 3 generations issued a quiet statement reconsidering the policy within the week. A historian on a border world neither of us had ever heard of before published an old family record, passed down for generations, that lined up with Ishara's account far more closely than the official one anybody had ever been taught. Other species along the border, ones who had spent generations teaching their own children the same careful fear Corvus had nearly let cost Ishara her life, began asking questions their own governments had clearly hoped nobody would ever think to ask. The Concord did not collapse overnight. Empires built on centuries of manufactured fear rarely do, but something had cracked that was not going to be easily repaired, and Ren made it clear, in the careful diplomatic language his people seemed to specialize in, that the matter would not be permitted to simply fade back into the silence it had relied on for so long. Ren visited me alone once, while Ishara was still unconscious, and told me something I had not expected to hear from a species I had spent my whole life believing were simply the calm, patient half of a story built around fearing the other. "Do you know why our men are never feared, the way our women are?" he asked, watching the same viewport I had grown used to standing at. "It is not because we are harmless, it is because we chose, generations ago, to be the ones who speak first, so that the ones who must sometimes act would never have to carry the burden of being misunderstood as well as feared. It is its own kind of duty, quieter than hers, rarely noticed. I confess there are days I envy how simply your species seems to move between the two, speaking and acting both, without needing to divide the labor of it so completely." "That sounds lonely," I said. "Building a whole life around being the one nobody's afraid of so someone else can carry the part they are." "It is," Ren admitted, "though I have never heard anyone say so quite that plainly before." He turned from the viewport. "Perhaps that is what your species actually offers the rest of us, Kate Ellison. Not courage alone. Every species has courage, somewhere, when it is required of them. Perhaps what you offer is simply the willingness to hold both halves of a thing at once, without deciding in advance which half deserves the fear and which deserves the trust." I thought about that long after he had gone, turning it over the way I imagined Ishara had once turned over an unfamiliar piece of dried fruit, testing whether it fit anywhere in a life I had understood very differently only a week earlier. Ishara woke on the 3rd day, and the first thing she did, once the translator had caught up with the fact that she was actually conscious again, was ask whether the fragment had survived. "It survived," I told her, along with the version of the story that comes with it. Something in her expression, even through the plating and the unfamiliar geometry of a face, built so differently from my own, resolved into something I had no trouble reading at all. Relief. "Then it was worth the wound," she said, and I understood she meant both wounds, the one from the landing field and the one from the corridor, and possibly every wound that had come before either of them, stretching back to whatever it had cost her, personally, to carry proof of her own homeworld's grief, for years, before anyone was willing to actually listen to it. "It would have been worth it either way," I said. "You being alive to see it land is just the better version." She held my wrist again, the same gesture from the landing field, except this time neither of us needed the weight of it to mean survival. It just meant something closer to staying, and I found I did not mind at all what that particular word was going to cost either of us to figure out over however much time came next. Elena checked the wound one final time before finally allowing herself to sit down, exhaustion catching up with her all at once now that there was nothing left urgent enough to hold it back. "For the record," she said, not looking up from her work, "I would like it noted that I treated a war mother's injuries 3 separate times over the course of 1 week, and at no point did any of those injuries turn out to be the dangerous part of this station." "Noted," Ishara said, the word arriving clean through a translator that seemed, day by day, to need less and less help catching up with her. The station itself changed in ways I noticed slowly, the way you notice a season turning, rather than a single obvious event. Traders who had rerouted 100 light-years around this border for longer than anyone alive could remember began asking, quietly at first, then less quietly, whether that reroute was still necessary. A handful of them started running the direct path again within the first month, more within the months after that, and Corvus Way Station, once a station people passed through as quickly as possible on the way to somewhere safer, slowly became something else instead. A crossing point. A place where 2 species, who had spent centuries, defined by a story neither of them had actually chosen, finally started building something that belonged to both of them on purpose. Derek redesigned the evacuation drills himself, exactly as Voss had promised Priya he would, though the new version bore almost no resemblance to the old one. Instead of sealed doors and silent corridors, it taught first contact, patience, the particular value of a medkit over a weapon when the situation actually called for it. He asked me to help him write the first draft, which felt like its own kind of ending to an argument that had started with him grabbing my arm in a corridor and ended with him putting his own body between danger and people he barely knew. Ren returned twice more over the following months, each time with less formality and more of the easy warmth I imagined his people reserved for something closer to friendship than diplomacy. On his final visit, he brought with him the first joint transit convoy, 3 Kryvax vessels and 2 human trade ships running the direct border route together for the first time in longer than either species had bothered to count. And I stood on the observation deck with Ishara beside me, watching 5 very different ships hold formation across a border that had spent centuries being nothing but a warning. "They asked me once," Ishara said, watching the convoy settle into approach, "why a war mother would let a human close enough to matter. What did you tell them?" "That you did not ask to be let close. You simply did not leave." She looked at me, and whatever expression crossed her face then, I understood it clearly enough without any translation at all. It is a difficult thing to explain to a species raised entirely on stories about how afraid everyone should be of us. Harder still to explain that the fear was never really about us at all. It was built, carefully, by someone who profited from everyone else staying exactly far enough away to never learn otherwise. And now there is a convoy on approach that would not exist a year ago. Now there is a station that used to empty its corridors at the first alarm, and instead held a line for someone it barely knew, because one person refused to let fear finish making the decision before anyone else had a chance to think it through. I watched the convoy grow larger against the dark, 5 ships where there had once only ever been silence and rumor, and thought about the alarm that had pulled me out of bed months earlier, the corridor emptying in the opposite direction while I ran toward exactly the thing everyone else had been taught, their whole lives, to run from. I thought about a landing field, and a weapon lowering an inch at a time, and a question asked through a broken translator that I still did not have a complete answer for, not really, beyond the simple fact that leaving had never once felt like something I was capable of doing. Turns out, the most frightening thing about my own species was never that we do not feel fear the same way everyone else does. We feel it plainly, same as anyone. It just never seemed to occupy the seat where the actual deciding happens. Ishara's hand found mine as the first Kryvax vessel settled into its berth, 5 ships and 2 species, and a border that no longer meant only one thing to everyone who crossed it. And for the first time since an alarm had torn through my sleep and sent me running the wrong way down a very frightened corridor, staying exactly where I was felt like the easiest decision I had made in months. Priya found us there afterward, watching the docking clamps engage, and stood beside us a while without saying anything at all. When she finally spoke, it was quieter than I expected from someone who had held a corridor with nothing but a length of pipe and a jammed weapon. "I used to have nightmares about this," she said, "about a ship like that showing up, and what it would mean for all of us. I had that exact nightmare the week before the crash, if you can believe it." "What do you have now?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, watching the last of the convoy settle into its berth. "Now I just have a very long shift ahead of me, helping the dock crew figure out how to process manifests from ships that used to only exist in stories." She almost smiled. "I think I prefer this version." "So do I," Ishara said, and Priya, to her credit, did not flinch at hearing a war mother say something so plainly ordinary. Derek joined us last, arriving the way he always did, quietly and a little late, coffee in hand, out of habit, even though the hour no longer called for it. He looked at the convoy, then at Ishara, then at me, and something in his face settled into an expression I had not seen on him before, that whole first night on the landing field. "New evacuation drills go into effect next week," he said. "Figured you'd both want to be there when we run the first one. Seems only fair, given whose idea half of it was." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. Below us, the convoy's crews began the long, ordinary work of unloading cargo that had crossed a border most of them had spent their whole lives avoiding. 5 ships worth of proof that a story built to keep 2 species apart had finally, carefully, quietly, begun to come apart at the seams. I stood at that viewport a long while, Ishara's hand still in mine, and let myself simply watch it happen, one crate and one handshake and one small, unremarkable act of trust at a time.